We kindle the light of our liberal faith. May it be the light of knowledge to dispel ignorance, the light of reason to dispel superstition, the light of love to dispel bigotry and inhumanity, no matter what their guise. So, our first hymn this morning reflects the season, and it's by Sidney Knight, who was one of my favourite Unitarian ministers. He was the London District Minister when I first started taking a lot of services. I'd taken one before, but in the 1970s. I knew him very well indeed, and we're going to sing his hymn, 268 Moods of Summer. And all of the Sidney Knight hymns well constructed and full of meaning. Now let us join together in prayer. God of life, of truth, of love, we need this time together to remember your presence. In the midst of those who celebrate life, who seek truth, who love. In your presence our celebrations are hallowed. In your presence our quests are fulfilled. In your presence our loves are enlarged, and compassion draws us all within the sacred circle of being. You whose image we carry with us in our hearts, wherever we venture, even in our hearts breaking, we need this time alone to remember your presence. We need this time to know, after self-doubt and quiet desperation, the spirit of life that stirs us and shakes us from within. We need this time to confess our self-centered despair, our petty fears, our destructive deeds, and to heed the moral law within, your gift of conscience. We need this time, company, and compassionate friend, to weep for our betrayals of life and truth, of loyalty and love. You who hears every true prayer and answers in our rising again to new life, may we live our lives more joyfully, understand our lives more truly, and love life more faithfully, as you have given us to ourselves to do. Amen. For the first reading this morning, I'm reading from a new book, early this year, a book by Rowan Williams, long-time Archbishop of Canterbury, now Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. The book's called Being Human, Bodies, Minds, Persons. But this passage that I'm going to read is about time. I want to suggest that attitudes to time and the passage of time are deeply characteristic of distinctly religious behaviour. People of faith do things with the calendar. As you know, one of the easiest default settings, if in doubt as to what to teach in religious education in schools, is to teach children about festivals. I break off here to say I know this because when my first family was in primary school in North Wembley, the local primary school was about 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Hindu, and the other third Christian and everything else as well. See? And the head teacher, in order to try and prevent parents from wishing to exclude their children from the morning assembly, solved the problem by celebrating every religious festival known to mankind. So we had, they had something like 2 or 3 a week, and they got around it that way. Robert Williams goes on to say, and although that can sometimes be anecdotal and unhelpful, the instinct behind it is not completely faulty. How religious communities spend their time is a serious and central theme. Time is not undifferentiated. Its passing is marked in ways that are thought to be significant. So, the passage of time becomes not just a trajectory of acquisition, acquiring property, acquiring power, acquiring security. It comes to be about the repeated accumulation, as you might say, of meaning, returning to symbolic resources to rediscover aspects of the universe you inhabit, aspects of yourself, to reconnect specific ongoing experiences with steady, regular or rhythmical patterns laid out in the language and practice of a religious community. You keep going back to the practices, the stories in celebration and commemoration. Time, therefore, becomes neither simply cyclical nor simply linear. It moves. You change. And at the same time, there is something to which you return, to rediscover and enlarge the understanding acquired in the passage of time. And all of that adds up to dissolving any idea that time is a limited commodity, or indeed any kind of commodity that has to be squeezed as hard as possible in order to keep the trajectory of acquisition going. Time is a complex and rich gift. It is the medium in which we not only grow and move forward, but also constructively return and literally resource ourselves. There are deep implications within that for how we approach human work and human well-being, and how we understand and how we cultivate a fruitful rhythm in action and human engagement. Increasingly, one of the marks of a fully and uncompromisingly secular environment is the notion of undifferentiated time. There are, for mature late capitalism, no such things as weekends. The problem with this kind of secularization is not so much a denial of the existence of God as a denial of the possibility of leisure, of time that is not spent in giving and serving the market. That's to say, for a particular mindset, acquisitive and purpose-driven, the passage of time is precisely the slipping away of a scarce, valuable commodity, every moment of which has to be made to yield its maximum possible results, so you can't afford to stop. This kind of secular understanding of the passage of time is perhaps one of the areas in which there is most open collision between the fundamentally religious and the fundamentally anti-religious mindset. I think that that's one of the untold stories of our time. We imagine quite often that the really fundamental collisions are around metaphysics or ethics. But perhaps there's another area at least as important, which is how we approach the time we are in, the time we spend, and indeed the time we waste. Rowan Williams. For the sake of reading, I've brought along the complete works of William Shakespeare, but you're not going to get all of it. You're just going to get 14 lines. Sonnet number 12. When I do count the clock that tells the time, and see the brave day sunk in hideous night, when I behold the violet past prime, and sable curls all silvered o'er with white, when lofty trees I see, barren of leaves, which erst for heat did canopy the herd, and summer's green all girded up in sheaves, borne on the bier with white and bristly beard. Then of thy beauty do I question make, that thou amongst the wastes of time must go, since sweets and beauties do themselves forsake, and die as fast as they see others grow. And nothing against time's scythe can make defence, save breed to brave him when he takes thee hence. Let us take time for a short meditation. Just to sit quietly and focus on being in this chapel, church, call it what you will. Let all other thoughts subside. Let them go to the back of the mind. And in the silence of this place, let our thoughts focus on our inner selves, on the quiet centre within. Focus on this centre and feel an inner peace that can rise up to fill all your thoughts. Be aware of the peacefulness of this building and its history. Think of the many prayers that have been said here. Feel the holiness that has come through prayer. This is the place and the time to be closely connected to the faith of this church. So let our quiet minds tune in to this holiness, absorb it into the quiet peacefulness of our inner selves. Let us spend 2 or 3 minutes in quiet prayer and meditation, following which time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its sons away. They fly forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day. You'll be familiar with those words by Isaac Watts from one of our best known hymns that's often sung at Remembrance Day services. You know, oh God, I help in ages past, that's the one. It reminds us that the passage of time is always with us and cannot be escaped. It's sometimes said, isn't it, as a kind of joke, that the only certain things in life are death and taxes. But I would definitely add the passage of time to that list. I was reminded of this inevitability when I was reading this latest book by Rowan Williams, and I picked up at Wakefield Cathedral Bookshop earlier this year. And I was intrigued by the title when I picked it up. Being Human, Bodies, Minds, Persons. Given the reputation of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a professor of divinity at Oxford before he became a bishop, of course he's now gone back to the academic life. Given his reputation as an intellectual thinker, I didn't expect it to be an easy read. And indeed, the passage I read to you earlier, when I used the time, is one of the most accessible passages in this short but hard-hitting book. Be that as it may, I started to think about time. As a young boy of about 7 or 8, I was lucky enough to be taken with my parents on holiday to France. And it soon became apparent that I had some kind of natural aptitude for languages, French in particular. So it was no surprise that later on at school I found myself doing French A-level. Indeed went on to do degree languages, but as part of that course I learned to poem by Alphonse de Lamartine, who was a prominent poet and politician of the Romantic French school of the mid-19th century, early 19th century perhaps. The poem is called Le Lac, the lake, and it bemoans the fact that time cannot be halted. I could quote half of it to you from memory now in French, but you may be relieved to hear that somebody has translated it into surprisingly accurate English verse. And it starts, so, driven onward by new shores, driven onward to new shores forever, in the night eternal swept away. Upon the sea of time, can we not ever drop anchor for one day? But of course we can't. And later in the poem he says, there is no port for man, no shore for time. It keeps flowing and we pass on. Any thought we've ever had about controlling the course of time have obviously just been fantasy. There's a scene in one of the Superman films, I don't know whether anybody saw them, where our hero manages to reverse the rotation of the Earth, to stop and reverse the rotation for just long enough for his beloved Lois Lane to escape from falling into some abyss or other she would have been lost in. You saw that. And of course, there have been stories written about, many stories written about time machines which enable humans to go back and forwards in time. There was even reference to one in a Father Brown story on television a couple of weeks ago that Rosemary and I watched. Of course, one in the Father Brown story turned out to be fake. So, given that we can't in the real world stop time, nor even control it, what do we do about it? We can use it. And it's how we use it that can make an enormous difference to our lives. And that's what Rowan Williams is getting at when he analyses possible attitudes to time. Because time is inexorable and death inevitable, he will leave taxes out with the word. We only have a limited amount of time to do all the things we want to do. So what is important is how we spend our time. Professor Williams, that's how he likes to be called nowadays, Professor Williams, is saying, I think, that religious people spend their time differently. There's another sonnet, a well-known sonnet by this time William Wordsworth, which starts off by bemoaning the way in which many of us spend our time. You've heard this before, some of you. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Now what they're both saying is that we spend too much time, waste too much time, you could say, on things which are of little or no importance. Wordsworth calls it getting and spending. Williams calls it acquiring property, acquiring power, acquiring security, a trajectory of acquisition. And while it may be justified and genuinely necessary to spend some of our time on these things, enough to make sure we are fed, clothed, housed, and generally looked after, we should probably spend more time thinking about who we are and working on what we might become. Rowan Williams calls this the accumulation of meaning. He points out that in today's society, where work goes on every day and every night, with modern communications meaning that work never stops, there are no such things as weekends anymore. We have gone away from this much time for work, this much time for leisure, this much time for religious observances. But I think we look at time wrongly if we look at it purely as a commodity, like any other commodity, to be used and exploited for our own benefit and purposes. Time, says Rowan Williams, is a gift, complex and rich gift, in which we can not only grow and move forward, but also constructively return and resource ourselves. So how do we spend our time when we're not doing specific tasks like cooking or washing up or work? And is any of that time wasted? What does it mean anyway? Wasted time. Time wasted. Is time ever completely wasted? I'm sure you have all heard of the village yokel who, when asked how he spent his free time, he said, sometimes I just sits, sometimes I sits and thinks, and sometimes I just sits. Sometimes I sits and thinks, sometimes I just sits. Is there anything wrong with that? To just sit? Do we sometimes get obsessed with having to spend all our time doing something? Do we really need, as Rudyard Kipling exhorts his son in that well-known poem, If? Do we need to fill each unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run? Might it not be better to allow time to flow gently on? To stop for a minute not to stop time, I know we can't do that, but to allow time to flow gently on without worrying about it. As you know, I always give a little time for silent prayer or meditation in the middle of a service I conduct. I did so this morning. What did you do with that time? Did you sit and think, or did you just sit? You don't need to answer. Either is fine with me. So now and again, I invite you to stop and think about time and the passage of time and how it's treated you and how you're treating it. Since reading Rowan Williams' challenging book, I have begun to treat time with a little more respect. But of course, as is so often the case, I'm preaching to the converted because all of you have made the choice to come here on a Sunday morning to give time to religion and use it for what Rowan Williams would call resourcing ourselves. So that when we leave here, we're glad we've come. And we can approach the coming week with a firmer spring in our step, is that how you call it? Yes. Than we would have done if we hadn't made the effort and given the time to come here. And that means that our time has been well spent indeed.